In this video, I'm going to share the basics on cattle nutrition and what you should know about their diets. By the end of this, you'll feel a lot more confident buying feed, or you might even be ready to grow all of their feed 100% by yourself. More specifically, I'm going to talk about how much feed your cattle need, what that feed will cost you from the feed store, how much meat you can expect per steer, some simple cattle nutrition, which feeds you should grow, and then how much space it's going to take you to actually grow those feeds. And then finally, I'll get into the cost of growing your own cattle feed. Please note that this video is about beef animals and it is not about dairy cattle. I will be doing a video on that later. You can use this kind of as a basis to kind of work those numbers on your own if you're here early. But just know that I'm going to have one of those coming soon too. Cattle feed is a surprisingly controversial subject, but I'm going to do my best to fairly share both sides of this reasoning so that way you can draw your own conclusions. Cattle need forage of some kind, usually pasture and grass for the warmer part of the year, and then hay in the cooler months. Some people will exclusively use pasture, and some people will exclusively use hay. Cattle do not need grains or concentrates. With that said, though, concentrates are an option too. These are never fed alone, they're always in addition to the forage. If you see someone who is giving concentrates only, they likely have ground up forage within that concentrate. These speed up production, they generally cost less, and they're usually more efficient in some ways depending on the region. I'll talk about grass finished versus grain finished later on. You can feed up to 3% of your animal's body weight in concentrates per day. This ranges from 6 to 50 pounds of feed per day per animal. Yes, really, cattle can eat up to a full bag of feed every day once they've been acclimated to it. Most people opt for 2%, but anything under 3% is generally accepted. You can share a handful of grain every day just to make friends with them if you want to. There's no such thing as too little grain, but there is such thing as too much, especially if you're feeding too much too fast. Be slow and intentional when you're adding concentrates into their diets. Forage should be about 2% of their body weight per day. Actually, this 2% should be dry matter, but I'll talk about that later. For now, just know that their forage intake should be 2 to 4% of your beef's body weight per day. It's a common misconception that growing cattle need more food than adults, but the reality is that they need a higher percentage of fats and proteins. No matter the age, though, they should eat 2 to 4% of their body weight every day. The average cow will eat about 2.5 tons of forage in the first year and then about 4.4 tons of forage every year after that. By the way, I wrote a 7,000-word article on the homesteaderschronicle.com first before making this video. You can find all of my sources plus some other helpful goodies on that post. I'll make sure that I link to it in the description. I think you're going to find a lot of other good homesteady stuff on the Homesteader's Chronicle too. The average adult will eat about 10 round bales, while the average growing calf will need around 5. This assumes that they are only eating hay and they are not given any pasture. Of course, this is much lower if they have access to grass. Now that you know all that, we can figure out the cost to feed a cow with the feed store. Most round bales are 700 to 1,000 pounds, though you will occasionally get a few outliers depending on how tight the baler is set. Basically, you can expect 5 to 7 rounds per growing beef, or 9 to 13 rounds for an established adult. At $60 per round, that is between $300 and $780 per year per animal. At $100 per round, that is between $500 and $1,300 per year per animal. At $200 per round bale, that is between $1,000 and $2,600. And finally, at $300 a round, that is between $1,500 and $5,200 per animal per year. I highly recommend that you look into your local market so that way you know what to expect, not just for this year and the upcoming years, but also look back at historical droughts so that way you know what to expect if you have a really bad hay year. When it comes to grains, your costs can fluctuate a lot. Generally, the chain feed stores like Rural King, Murdoch's, or Tractor Supply is the most expensive. You'll usually buy by the bag there. Your local feed stores and feed mills are generally more affordable, and there you can buy in bulk or by the bag. And if you're lucky, you might be able to buy directly from a farmer. That is generally just for bulk purchases, but you might find a few outliers who will let you fill up your own feed sacks. Finding a farmer is a bit of a side quest because most of your older crop farmers are not online, so you're going to have to ask around to find them. Sometimes they'll have something on Craigslist, but it's usually better to just find them through word of mouth. Direct through the farmer is usually the most affordable, and in my biased opinion, it's the most meaningful. Buying bulk is cheaper, but you'll need to have a storage solution like a hopper, silo, or a grain bin. If you want to raise two beef from calves and finish them at a year old, you'll need around 2.5 tons of feed for each. Buying a 5-ton silo will let you keep all of the feed you need on hand and away from mice. Let's compare the cost differences between bulk and bag. Please note that this is based on the market here in northwestern Montana and into eastern Washington. These numbers are probably going to be different for you. By the bag, you're looking at $16 to $24 each. The perk of buying bags is that you don't have to worry about storage or pests like mice. If the feed store has an infestation, that is completely their problem and you don't have to take those bags. You can find good bags in the store or go somewhere else. The perk of buying bulk is the security of knowing that you have enough feed on hand and that you're getting a really nice discount. You can buy feed by the tote too, which is 1 ton each. While a hopper is usually the most ideal storage option, metal barrels, old deep freezers, or even the tote itself are perfectly fine storage options. In my area, I can buy corn directly from the farmer for around $380 per ton, which is less than $1,000 per beef. So for me to raise 2 cattle, I could pay my local farmer almost $2,000, or I can pay the feed store almost $3,000. I think it's really easy to see what a big difference this makes in especially larger herds. And don't worry, I will get to the part where I show you what it takes to grow all this yourself so that way you can cut out the farmer or the feed store if you felt like it. Before we continue on, let's quickly talk about what to expect in exchange for all this feed and hard work that you're putting into your cattle. Basically, it takes 9 months for your cow to give birth. Sexual maturity happens at 12 to 16 months old, and most cattle are ready to butcher between 12 and 36 months, though there will be some people who butcher at 9 months, and there will be some people who decide to wait until 4 years old. When butcher date finally rolls around, expect 300 to 500 pounds of meat per beef. Most cattle will give you 40% of their live weight in meat. Many producers aim for about 1,200 pounds of live weight at the butcher date, so that translates to about 750 pounds of meat and bones, or 450 pounds of just the meat. You can get them to 1,200 pounds in 12 months if you give them 2% of their body weight in forage and 2% of their body weight in grains from 3 months on. This is called grain finishing. If you want to grass finish, this usually takes 2.5 to 3 years, sometimes 3.5 years, but it does not require you to buy or grow any grains. Several breeds, especially bulls, will hit 2,000 pounds as live weight. With that said, it's pretty rare to see this because it's wildly inefficient to keep and grow an animal that long if the only purpose is turning that animal into beef. 800 pounds of meat is a rarity that generally only happens when it's time to cull an old bull. Keep in mind that younger animals are much more efficient on feed, but fat is the last thing that they will grow. Bones and muscle are always the priority. Only once those have been established will the fat begin to pack on. This fat is essential for high-quality cuts like steaks. So really young beef animals are only good for lean hamburger meat, and they should not be used to make steaks. Longhorns, Shorthorns, Angus, and Herefords usually have a goal weight of 1,200 pounds. Charolais usually aim for 1,400 pounds, and I'm not sure what the goal is for Dexters and Highlanders. So if you raise them, I would love to hear from you in the comments, especially since those two breeds seem to be really well suited for our climate, and that would be great information for me to know. Most grass-finished beef will eat around 13,000 pounds of forage in their lifetime. Meanwhile, a grain-finished beef will eat somewhere around 9,000 pounds before their butcher date. So you get about 1 pound of meat back for every 29.5 pounds of feed given to a grass-finished animal versus 1 pound of meat back for every 20 pounds of feed given to a grain-finished animal. If you're watching this on your phone, don't forget that you can take screenshots as little makeshift notes. Here is a good comparison of cattle versus other animals' feed conversion ratios. I do have videos on rabbits, chickens, and goats right now for the How to Feed Your Animal Without the Feed Store series. I plan on doing more later on, so bookmark this for later if this is something that interests you. But yeah, I think this is super interesting to look at what it takes to get those animals up to their butcher date, how long it takes them, and how much feed you have to pour into that animal to get your pound of meat back. By the way, when I am talking about feed to conversion ratios, I am including whatever food that the animal finds out in the pasture. This is very difficult to track, but pasture space is so important and you're paying property taxes on it anyways, so I think that should count. So if an animal eats 2 pounds of hay, 1 pound of grain, and then eats 4 pounds of forage from the pasture, I'm going to say that that animal ate 7 pounds of feed. Some people are not going to count the food that comes from the pasture, and they would say that that animal only ate 3 pounds of food. It's important for you to know that the food that you directly give to the animal that is not your pasture is called an input. So if you give your animal 2 pounds of grain and they find 2 pounds out in the pasture, they had 2 pounds of input. A steer that is living completely on the pasture is going to eat more food over a longer period of time, but a cow who is eating hay and grains will require more of your labor, but on the plus side, they will be ready faster. Now, you remember that I said that dry matter is not the same as forage, and this is where that's going to come into play. Cattle usually waste 6 to 20% of their forage. They also waste a good part of their browse on pasture too, either by trampling it or via cow patty. There are several ways to reduce your hay waste. If you have good solutions, please share those in the comments because I think we all want to hear about it. Anyway, hay rings and hay nets are good starting places. Also, having feeders that are somewhat difficult for your cattle to pull their heads back through is another good option. Cattle like to pull a mouthful of hay out on the ground, pick through their favorite parts, and then leave the rest on the ground and then go back in for another mouthful. It's very wasteful. Making it too much work for them to drop it on the ground is really helpful in reducing your waste. Another option is mob grazing. If you have a large herd, you can roll out an entire run bale morning and evening, and they'll eat it quickly and indiscriminately because they know that it's going to be gone soon. If you don't have a large herd, you can have the option of forking hay out. This is exactly what it sounds like. Just place a bale of hay in the center of the barn out of their reach and unroll that bale with your pitchfork and feed it to them that way. This is a smaller scale version of mob feeding and it dramatically cuts down on the waste. Make sure that you do this at least twice a day, preferably more. Nobody asked for this, but yes, this is a cool barn. My great grandparents built this by hand using the timber from their homestead. This is them in front of their Sears and Roebuck house holding my grandpa as a baby. The trees they cut down for this barn cleared the space that they needed to grow tobacco, soybeans, and corn in their brand new fields. If you look closely, you can see that this barn doesn't have any hardware to hold it together structurally. It's an old-fashioned timber framing with wooden pegs to hold those giant hand-hewn beams together. The center of this barn is a raised platform designed to hold round bales just out of reach of the cattle, and the perimeter interior is a shelter and a feeding station for beef cattle. The loft used to hold cut tobacco, but now it's just square bale storage. I guess it's time to get back on track now. So your cattle need about 2% of their weight in dry matter. Most hay is 92% dry matter, while most grass is 15 to 20% dry matter. So if a 1,000-pound steer needs 2% dry matter, you might think that that's 20 pounds a day. But in all reality, hay is 92% dry matter and the steer is wasting 15% of it. So the steer actually needs 23.53 pounds, not 20 pounds. I know this feels like I'm splitting hairs, but I wanted to add this in because if you are doing all dry lot with hay, then that 3 pounds a day really does matter. If your cattle are out on pasture or if you're feeding them a lot of grain concentrates, you're probably not going to notice a difference here. But regardless, I wanted to make sure that you knew this so that way you're never short on hay or feed for your animals. So now we can start talking about how much forage you're going to get per acre, which will tell you about how much land you need for all of your beef cattle. I did not have the willpower to look up the average yields for every single state. Better than finding statistics online, please go to someone local in your state or more ideally in your county to get a rough estimate for how much hay you'll get per acre. They are going to be so much more accurate than anything that you find online. Nuance is so important here. I want you to look at Arizona and then I want you to look at Alabama and Indiana. Yeah. That seems astronomically high, and context is everything here. These numbers are state averages. They don't tell you whether they're using irrigation or drainage. They don't tell you how many times they're cutting per year, when they're cutting per year. They just tell you the total amount for the year. So in some places you're going to cut once a year, and in others you're going to cut 5, 6, or 7 times. So that all makes a huge difference. Arizona is heavily irrigating their hayfields, while Indiana, Alabama, and Iowa are relying on whatever rainfall they get. Another strong example of context being important is Montana's stats. Here in Montana, you need 75 acres of pasture per animal, yet the average hay yield is 1.6 tons. What's the deal with this huge discrepancy? Well, these hay fields that count towards the state average are intensively irrigated and also fertilized. Many are even tilled at least once to soften up the compacted and rocky soil. On the other hand, pasture and rangeland is not irrigated, it's not fertilized except for what the cattle do, and it is really not managed. These care differences are why the 1.6 acre hayfield is just as productive as the 75 acres of wild rangeland. Using those state hay yield averages, we can now calculate about how much space it takes to grow all of the hay for your animals per year. After removing our two outliers, Alaska and Arizona, it's easy to see that it typically takes about 2 acres to support one beef animal. I've noticed you seem to prefer videos under 30 minutes, so I'm going to skip this section on how we historically fed cattle. If that's something that interests you, please let me know and I will happily make a video on that. A fun little tidbit is that we used to make our cattle grotesquely fat on purpose. We used beef fat for lots of cooking and projects and skincare, but this fat also protected the meat during the curing and transportation stage. Those old railroad cars used to have beef slabs hung on the hooks and sawdust scattered down below on the floor. So if the meat fell off the rack and into the sawdust during transport, butchers would simply trim off the dirty fat and then save the rest of the meat. Now we can cover those essential nutrients beef cattle need. This will make you a lot more confident the next time you shop in the feed store, and it'll set you up to know how to grow, calculate, and mix your own feed blends. For the sake of not being repetitive, I'm not going to tell you how the digestive system works. If that's something that interests you and you want to learn about, make sure you click over to the How to Feed Goats Without the Feed Store video and look for the timestamp to jump you right to that. They work very similarly, and that's something that's really important to know. But if you've been watching this series all the way through, I don't want to bore you with repeated details. Carbs and crude fiber are generally something you don't really need to worry about when you're looking at formulating your cattle's feed plan because these are such a natural part of their diet. It's not something that you need to make space for. Digestible carbs are energy and calories, while indigestible carbs are called fibers, and that's what keeps everything moving through your cattle's digestive system so that way they don't have any blockages or bloat. Most of your feed bags are going to tell you about fiber content, but they won't tell you about the carbs. The best way to find carbs is to add up all of the nutrients and then subtract that from 100, and what you're left with is your carb percentage. Cattle need fatty acids to absorb the vitamins and nutrients that they take in, but it should not exceed 7% of their diet. Cattle are ruminant animals with basically a fermentation vat going on inside them. They have rumen microbes that will essentially drown if there's too much fat. Plus, high fatty acid leads to diarrhea, which causes dehydration and weight loss, which you really don't want in your beef cattle. Soybeans and soybean meal is a great source of both fat and protein for cattle, but I wanted to make a little disclaimer here and say that you shouldn't feed soybeans to your cattle until they're at least 300 pounds, preferably 500 or 600 pounds. This is because they're not really good when they are pre-ruminating animals. It takes a while for their digestive system to be established, so you don't want to put that in there too soon. When you do decide to start soybeans, feed them a small quantity to get the fat content up and cycle faster. Plus, you should only feed soybean meal and not crushed or whole soybeans. Soybean meal is what's left over after the oil has been extracted from it, which is what goes into our vegetable oils and our cooking oils. Whole soybeans are 20% fat, and it should never exceed 10% of their diet. That is because of this extremely high fat content. Soybean meal, on the other hand, is 0.5 to 2% fat, and it should be under 25% of their diet. Also, soybeans go bad within 3 weeks of being ground, so store them whole and then grind them every week or every 2 weeks as needed if you're keeping them on your property after you've grown them yourself. Protein is more important for younger animals and less important for the older steers. Alfalfa is pretty high in protein, usually 12 to 28% protein, and the most that a calf usually needs is in the 16% range. So if you're going to feed alfalfa, give it to your calves and in smaller quantities. Your adults really don't need it. It's going to be a bit too much for them. Around 10% protein, which makes it perfectly acceptable for your older steers. The protein content is why I did not combine the beef cattle with the dairy cattle. And that is because dairy cattle need a lot more protein, and I wouldn't have a good way of mixing those without doing one or the other a disservice. Dairy cows eat a lot of alfalfa. Minerals are most often found in your younger plants, especially your younger weeds out in the pasture. That's a great source for your cattle. Don't forget that you can take screenshots. Here are some of the minerals that your cattle need. When it comes to vitamins, vitamin A, D, and E are the most important, though there are others that they should get. Vitamins aren't usually as nutritionally dense in your grains, but they are pretty common in wild forages in your pasture and some of your hays and alfalfa sprouts. Now we can combine all of this together to talk about how much space it's going to take you and the best feed formulations for if you want to feed your animals concentrates. We already know that it's going to take around 5 round bales to feed a calf for the year and 10 round bales to feed a full adult for the year. That assumes that they are on dry lot and only eating hay. I'm going to give you 3 options here so you can choose what would suit you and your homestead the absolute best. Option number 1 is feeding 80% corn, 10% soybean meal, and 10% oats, with your cattle still getting 100% of the forage. I am now 4 videos deep, and I just now found this amazing calculator that would have made my previous videos so much easier. So if you want to see this calculator that makes it really easy to balance and ration your own feed, go over to thehomesteaderschronicle.com. I've got that linked in the How to Feed Your Cattle Without the Feed Store article. This corn, soybean meal, and oat blend will get you 13.6% protein, 4.3% fat, 3.1% fiber, and 79% carbohydrates. Option 2 is not an option if you want to completely ditch the feed store, but it does get you a lot of food really quickly, which makes it very appealing to homesteads that have smaller acreage. This formulation is 86 to 99.8% corn or your grain of choice, and then 0.2% to 14% concentrate. And your cattle, of course, are still getting 100% of their forage. For example, you might mix 6 parts corn to 1 part concentrate, or for some of these specific bags, you would mix 2 to 4 pounds of this to every 1 ton of corn or your grain of choice. This gives you the option to grow a lot of your feed for yourself, but at the same time use something that is already balanced and will have different supplements like vitamins and minerals to make sure that your cattle are getting a truly complete diet. Option 3 is a bit old-fashioned, but it's old-fashioned because it works for a lot of people, and that is feeding 100% cracked corn for up to 2% of their body weight daily, and of course you're feeding that alongside 100% of their forage. This gets you 9% protein, 5% fat, 7% fiber, and 73% carbohydrates. Now that we have 3 formulas to work with, we can start calculating how much space it takes to grow each of these ingredients for our beef cattle. Corn is the most space-efficient grain, making it very practical and economical for homesteaders. About half of an acre will grow 100% of a steer's feed for the year if corn is the only grain given. If you are going to mix this corn with the oats and the soybean meal, then you need 0.44 of an acre of corn per steer. For the option 1 feed mix, you are going to need 450 pounds of soybean meal per steer. So if you are doing whole soybeans, you need about 1/10 of an acre per steer. And if you are doing the soybean meal, which I recommend, that is going to be about 1/4 of an acre per animal. For oats to make up 10% of the option 1 concentrate, you need 450 pounds, and it is going to take almost 4,000 square feet to grow that 450 pounds of oats. Now we get to total all this space up. So for forage only, it's going to be between 1/2 and 3 acres per animal per year on a hay-only diet. It could be up to 75 acres per animal if they are grazing on poor pasture or on rangeland. It's going to take 1/2 an acre if you are only feeding corn per animal, or 3/4 of an acre if you are feeding that option 1, which is 80% corn, 10% soybean meal, and 10% oats. A grain-finished beef will be ready in 1 year after using 1.5 acres, while a grass-finished beef will be ready in about 2 years after using 3.35 acres. You could technically call this like 6.7 acres if you manage your land poorly and you can't put them on the same lot 2 years in a row, but for the most part, 3.35 acres. If you feel like growing your own feed, this is what it's going to cost you. Keep in mind, I'm just telling you what the seeds are. I am not telling you what your property taxes are, what you're going to pay in irrigation. I have no idea how much water costs you. I don't know what your fertilizing methods are. That is all on you. I'm giving you a good starting point, and then you can run with that after you've got this very basic information to get you started, okay? If you buy dent corn online, you might be paying around $96 for a 50-pound bag, and you're going to need about 148 to 184 pounds of this corn to feed each beef. So this means it's going to cost about $288 to $350 in seeds per beef animal. I found a 50-pound bag of soybean seed for $47.77. And since you need almost 17 pounds per beef, that is going to cost you about $17 per beef to grow all of their soybeans for the year. You need just over 12 pounds per cow for their oat seeds, which is going to translate to $67.96 per beef. In total, it's going to cost you between $353 and $380 to grow all of your grains for each beef animal. Keep in mind that going to the feed store, that's around $900 per animal, so you are saving around $600 by doing it yourself. If you're really dedicated to the whole self-sufficiency thing, you can seed save from your crop, and that will make sure that you don't have to buy seeds in the following years. If you want to be really safe about it, plant an extra 10% just for the purpose of seed saving, and then take the very best of whatever you grow and put that aside for the next year. With 1 ear of corn, you're going to get about 800 seeds. Each wheat plant gives you around 100 berries. A barley plant is up to 48 new plants, and an oat plant is up to 48 new plants. So every plant that you save will give you at least a 48% return. I have had some people concerned about plant losses because of droughts and wildlife coming in, and all of the figures that I shared and the yields that I shared are national averages, so these already have the losses built into them. So you don't need to account for anything more than what's already been accounted for your region. If you liked this video, I have 3 more just like it on rabbits, chickens, and goats, so check those out if you want. I'll be doing something for dairy cattle and pigs soon. I don't know when, but we'll get to it when we can. It's starting to warm up outside, so that's really nice. This is what it looks like outside, so definitely getting better. Anyway, check out those 3 videos if you want to. I will have more coming soon, and thanks for sticking around this long. If you can't tell by the sounds out there, I have some kids to go wrangle.